Welcome aboard. This video documents construction progress on the Yellow Creek Railroad during the year 2024. The plan for the train layout, and later the entire basement, was developed using any rail software. The indoor portion of the railroad includes a folded dog bone on the lower level, connected to a loop-to-loop climbing to an upper level. By the end of 2023, all indoor portions of the layout were nearing completion. While 99% of the indoor right-of-way was operational, only about 60% of the scenery had been completed. This is an overall look at the railroad in January of 2024 as viewed from the control panel monitors. Still a lot of scenery to finish. My first priority this year, wiring issues. First, voltage drops on long wire runs was causing unrealistic speed changes when climbing grades and transiting between track blocks. Second, the current two-panel setup prohibits switching the main yard at Hawkbill, the Mountain Division at Andrews, and the Valley Division at Bath all simultaneously. Third, we cannot reverse locomotives to switch along the balloon track at Andrews, due to it being wired for unidirectional travel. Additionally, I want to add a runaround track at Andrews. And I need to solve some drifting issues with a couple of the MRC Tech 2 throttles. My current setup has two control panels shown in red. Each panel has an MRC throttle. Half of the layout track blocks are controlled from each panel as annotated here. When operating a locomotive from the Hawkbill panel, climbing the 3% grade into Bath, 14 volts from the throttle at Hawkbill, ends up being 11 volts at the track block to the locomotive. First, the current runs through 100 feet of 14-gauge copper-clad aluminum wire to Bath, so only 13 volts reaches the Bath panel. Current then runs through extensive 18-gauge interconnecting wiring and switches inside the Bath panel, dropping it to 12 volts coming out. Finally, current runs through 20 feet of 18-gauge copper-clad aluminum wire to the track block. The result, only 11 volts at the track, powering the locomotive climbing the grade. Some lessons I learned, and relearned, about wire. All 14-gauge stranded wire is not created equal. The two most common conductors are copper, which is expensive, and aluminum, which is cheap. Aluminum wire can have a copper coating. It's called copper-clad aluminum or CCA. But it's still aluminum and exhibits aluminum characteristics. Aluminum wire performance is similar to dropping down 1 gauge in copper. So a 14-gauge aluminum wire will conduct similar to a 16-gauge copper wire. Aluminum wire is also more susceptible to breakage. So, all of my long wire runs need to be upgraded. Or, up-gauged. The original control panel in Bath had controls for both the upper Andrews level and the lower Bath level. With only one throttle, trains could only be switched on one level at a time. In addition, as layout changes were made to add a team track and turntable, and the needed controls were added, the panel had become cluttered and somewhat confusing. Solution: replace the old Bath panel with two new ones. The two new panels would separate the upper Andrews controls from the lower Bath controls and provide another throttle for the additional panel. The new panels would also be relocated around the corners so they would directly face the areas they controlled. The track mimic bus, and the controls, will then be more spread out. So, it's out with the old, and in with the two new. First, the shells were built and hung in the new locations. Hinged, 1/8 inch, aluminum plates, were added and drilled for switch mounting. Next, the mimic bus and switches were installed. Then, internal wiring was completed. Finally, the external wiring was brought in. Most was pulled over from the old Bath control panel. For all mainline track blocks, new feeders were run with 14-gauge copper-clad aluminum wire. Interconnections between the three throttles, on the three control panels, were run with 12-gauge stranded copper low-voltage lighting wire. I installed two MRC Tech 2 Locomotion 2500 throttles on the new control panels. These throttles still had a small voltage output even when the throttle is set to 0. So, the engine motor hummed, or in some cases moved slowly along the track. I purchased some tamper-proof torque screwdriver bits to remove the back of the case so I could mount these to the control panels. With the back cover off, I found two trimmer potentiometers on the circuit board. By adjusting the trimmer pot located closest to the on-off switch, I was able to zero out the variable DC output when the throttle was set to 0. No more hum. While I was replacing the Andrews control panel, I went ahead and added a runaround siding by the Andrews station. So, it was back to cutting some sectional track bed from plywood. Below Andrews, there is room to stand up under the scenery. I added a couple staging tracks under here controlled from the bath panel. This will be a good place to stage a passenger train and a work train. June again, time for the annual pilgrimage to Slate Falls Outposts and Lake St. Joseph. It never gets old, but we do. Over the years they added boat slips with handrails, electric start motors, solar power, indoor plumbing, and all the conveniences. You can even rent a generator for your CPAP. Should be able to make this trip until I'm well into my 80s. This summer we got out on some overnight kayak camping trips. Really happy with how much gear we can pack into the Bonafide kayaks. We also made some changes to the Malone trailer to lower the kayak bunk rails, and add a rod storage tube above the kayaks. Makes it much easier for a couple old men to manhandle kayaks loaded with gear on and off the trailer. After some fishing, time to build some bridges. I generally build these upside down on a template. This trestle below Andrews Mine will allow operators a better view of the siding from the new control panel. These trusses are assembled from western red cedar ripped down on the table saw. Pieces are laid out, glued and clamped over a drawing covered with wax paper. The trusses were combined with trestle bents which form the approaches. Once installed, this will bring the high line over the valley division into Andrews. This is an overall look at the layout by the end of 2024. That's all for now folks, thanks for stopping by.